talking about chapter 17 of Genesis. If you have this stone, it's on page 73. Otherwise, we'll share the screen. And we're talking about the circumcision, the Brit, it's the covenant, Brit Milah, the covenant of the circumcision. And together with that, there are certain promises that God tells to Abraham. And you have God changes Abraham's name as well as Sarah's name.
What page is this?
On the stone Chumash, it's page 73.
Thank you.
We'll share the screen in a moment for the other, to see the version online, Genesis chapter 17. So we want to think about the circumcision. One of the questions we want to think about is, there was already a covenant. We had the covenant between the parts. And earlier it said, God says that he's promising us the land of Israel. That promise is reiterated here as well again. So why do we need the second promise, the second covenant? So that we want to address that. We also want to think about the conversation between Abraham and God, where God tells him, you're going to have another son, Isaac. Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son, Isaac. And you'd expect him to be very happy, but instead he almost is unhappy he says, what about Yishmael? He's nervous that would somehow take away the position of Ishmael, and that ties into the future stories. So we'll get into all of this. Just to begin, I just want to talk about we'll start with chapter 17, verse 1. So I'm going to share the screen here, chapter 17, verse 1. Good morning. So the verse says, and Abraham was 99 years old, and God appeared to Abraham, and he said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be perfect. Now, what is perfection? What does it mean to be perfect? I don't know if perfect is the perfect translation. Tamim is a tricky word. Complete. Complete may or may not be perfect, but complete, whole, wholesome. These are some of the translations of tamim. What is happening here? What's happening here is, let's think about this for a moment. How do you become complete? In other words, what is completion? So God wanted the world to be created in an incomplete form. And it should only become complete because through the human activity, because that would create a partnership between God and the people, right? If you look at Genesis and the story of creation, at the end of the sixth day, we say it every Shabbat in the prayer and in the Kiddush. What do we say? We say, God concluded the 6 days of creation, and through this he concluded everything. Asher bara Elokim la'asot, which God created, and then the word is God created to do. So the traditional commentators explain, the Medrash explains, God created to perfect. In other words, if your assumption is that God created a complete world, then you look around and you see, why is the world incomplete? Why are there so many problems? But if you understand that the reason why God created the world was that we should complete it, then you understand that what God really wants is a partnership. And that's why that partnership is expressed through the circumcision, because circumcision is something that the human being does, and it's something tangible that the human being does to perfect the creation of God. So that is sort of the introduction to the whole discussion of the circumcision. Now, so then we read a few more verses. We read about Abraham falling on his face. We discussed that last week. And then we want to look at verse 4, because verse 4 is an interesting verse. Verse 4 reads as follows. So verse 3 is, Abraham fell upon his face and God spoke with him, saying, verse 4, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall become a father of a multitude of nations. And this is where he changed his name, as you mentioned last week. But the words we're looking at, Hine briti itach, behold, my covenant is with you. Now, some of the commentaries say that language is indicative of something interesting, and that is not that the covenant is happening now. When you say, Hine, behold, my covenant is with you, it's telling you that the covenant the covenant already exists. Now I'm making it with you, right? Hine is almost past tense. behold. Behold means, look, my covenant that I already have, itach, I'm putting it with you. So this begs the question, what is the relationship between this covenant and the covenant that we already had earlier at the covenant between the parts? Because over here, if you see, for example, go down to verse number 8. And verse number 8, it says, and I will give you and your seed after you the land of your sojournings, the entire land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. And I will be for them to I will be to them for a God. Okay, so here we have the covenant. And what's the covenant? There's going to be circumcision, as we will see later. But here it's a reiteration of the covenant of the promise of the land of Israel. The problem is that just a page or two ago, we had the same covenant. If you look at chapter 15 and you look at verse 18, on that day, Hashem made a covenant with Abraham, saying to your descendants, I have given you this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. So in other words, there was already a covenant between God and Abraham. God already promised in the land of Israel. Here, all of a sudden, is a reiteration of the covenant, and the question is, how come? So one answer is, look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, the covenant that is already with you. Ani, look, behold, I already have a covenant, and now I'm making it with you again. But the covenant already exists. So what does this mean? What does this mean? So one interpretation is that, simple interpretation is that you have a covenant that was from God to Abraham, but it was only one way. It was everything that God will give for Abraham. God says, I will give you a child, and I will give you the land of Israel. And that was the covenant that we read, the covenant between the parts in chapter 15. But if you look at the covenant between the parts, what is Abraham's part of the deal? Nothing. There was nothing in the chapter 15 that Abraham was required to do. Now you turn to chapter 17, the chapter we're in now. And here, if you look at verse 4, it says, look, remember the covenant that I had with you? I'm placing it before you, but now there's a shift. What's the shift? Shift is verse 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and between you. Between me and between you means that it goes two ways. And therefore, in this covenant, all of a sudden, there's something that Abraham is supposed to do. And that starts in verse 9. And God said to Abraham, and you shall keep my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout the generations. And this is my covenant, which you shall observe between me and between you and between your seed after you, that every male among you be circumcised. In other words, here there's a new idea. The new idea is that the covenant is not one-way street, but it's being reiterated, not just from, God is reiterating the covenant because now God is saying it's more meaningful if it comes from you as well. That the human being participates in the covenant. It's not just from God to us, but God gives us an opportunity to participate in this covenant, and that is why it's reiterated here. The covenant that already exists is being presented again, but this time it's a two-way street. It's not only a one-way street. Okay, so that's one point. Another way to read this is verse 4, Hine briti itach, right? Going back to verse 4, behold, my covenant is with you. Again, my covenant, the assumption is from the grammar that my covenant already exists. And now God says, my covenant that already exists, I'm giving it to you. So another interpretation is, what covenant are we talking about that already existed? So the one I said earlier is the covenant from chapter 15, the covenant between the parts. That God says, I'm giving you the land of Israel, and now God reiterates it. But there's another interpretation. The other interpretation is, where else do you see a covenant before, up to this point in the Torah? You see the covenant that God created with Noah. After the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah. What's the covenant? No longer will he destroy the earth. In other words, God wants a covenant with humanity. The problem is that the people drifted away from this covenant. In other words, the people were not living up to this covenant. So what does God tell Abraham? Remember the covenant I made with humanity? I'm reiterating it with you because your job now is to bring humanity back to that covenant, right? So one way to look at this chapter is God is telling Abraham, what is your mission? Your mission is not just for the Jewish people, but your mission is actually consistent with what God says in verse 5, that you were changing your name to become the father of a multitude of nations. Meaning to say somehow this chapter is universal, Avram's universal mission, and because this chapter discusses Abraham's universal mission, therefore, God says, remember the covenant to Noach? Now it's your job to remind people about my covenant to Noach. So my covenant to Noach, my covenant to humanity, which I already created in earlier in the book with Noach, 10 generations prior, now I'm reiterating that to you because it's your job to bring people back to that covenant. And one more, if you want to think about the grammar, verse 2, I will place my covenants. But literally, verse 2 says, and I will give my covenants. Ve'etna, latet is to give. So the commentaries explain that if you look through the entire Bible, you almost never find the word giving a covenant. You have creating a covenant. Lichrot brit is the term. Lichrot is like to the different word for a covenant, never to give a covenant. So that helps this interpretation that the covenant already existed. God is not making a covenant at this point. The covenant with humanity was already created with Noach. God is giving this responsibility to Abraham. God is telling Abraham, this covenant to Noach, I want you to think about. I want it to be yours. In other words, your responsibility is to bring people back to that covenant. Okay, I want to say one more little detail, and then I want to go to the big picture and compare this chapter to the next chapter and talk about how there are various messages happening here simultaneously. But just one more detail, it's a detail in this story, but it's a beautiful concept about all of the Torah and Mitzvot in general. So if you look at chapter 10 and verse 10 and verse 11. So again, chapter 17, verse 10 and 11 on the Stone Chumash, it's on page 75. So let's see how we refer to the covenants. So, we'll read verse 9, why not? And God said to Abraham, and you shall keep my covenants, you and your seed after you throughout their generations. Okay. Verse 10, this is my covenant which you shall observe between me and between you and between your seed and your seed after you, that every male among you be circumcised. Okay, how did it refer to the covenant in this verse? This is my covenant. Now verse 11, and you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be as the sign of a covenant between me and between you. This point, how do you refer to the covenant? Not as the covenant, but as the sign of the covenant. So now the question is, two verses, 10 and 11, referring to the same thing. Once it refers to it as a covenant, and once it refers to it as a sign of the covenant. So which one is it? Is it the covenant, or is it a sign of the covenant? And what's the difference between a covenant and a sign of the covenants? So that's the question. So I thought
he refers to the circumcision as the sign of the covenant, not the covenant as the sign of the covenant.
Is the circumcision a covenant, or is it
the sign of the covenant?
You're right. It's the sign of the covenant. You're right in verse 11. In verse 11, the circumcision is the sign of the covenant. But in verse 10, circumcision is the covenant.
Rabbi, why can't it be both? Because the sign is something to remember by, and it's the thing itself.
Yes, Jill, you're right. That's my point. It is both. The question is, we want to figure out what is the covenant and what's the sign of the covenant. It is both. It clearly is both. And that's why the Torah uses the terms, both terms. But
from the point of view of of Abraham, this is a sign. From the point of view of Hashem, it already existed.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
The purpose of a sign is to make people remember. We can have a covenant, but I keep forgetting that we have a covenant. This is indelible. This is the remembrance of it, aside from the fact of it. It just people forget.
Okay, so
the promises they made.
The seats a covenant?
I'm sorry.
Wearing seats.
No, tefillin. The Torah refers to tefillin as a covenant, right? It should be a covenant on your arm. Shabbat is considered a covenant. Ot brit beni uvenichem. It's a covenant of it's a sign of the covenant between me and you. There are select mitzvot that are referred to as a sign. Shabbat is one, tefillin is another, circumcision in this case is another. By the way, that's one of the reasons, not everybody knows this, but it's interesting. One of the reasons why, not one of the reasons, the reason why we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. Why? Because tefillin is a covenant and Shabbat is a covenant. Now, if you put on tefillin on Shabbat, what you're saying is that the covenant of Shabbat is not strong enough, so it needs to be reinforced by the covenant of the tefillin. So it's dishonoring the covenant of Shabbat. Therefore, on Shabbat, we already have a covenant, a sign of a covenant, an oath breaks. So Shabbat is already the oath. The Shabbat, the fact that we celebrate Shabbat is a testimony, is a covenant is a sign for our covenant with God. So
but circumcision is a permanent covenant, and every Saturday passes, and you have a new one that you have to honor. So I don't.
Okay, so let me clarify what some of the commentaries say about covenant and sign of the covenant. And this is a broader question about all the mitzvot, because some mitzvot have reasons. Some mitzvot, very few mitzvot, the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses give a reason. Very few, but some they do. Shabbat is one example. Sitting in a sukkah is another. So you should remember that we sat in the huts. But not all the mitzvot have reasons in the Torah. Most do not. But post-biblical commentators, everybody is giving reasons for the commandments. Every mitzvah is supposed to create a certain awareness within the person. Like Jill says, you have to remember the message, right? The truth exists, the covenant exists, but you have to remember it. So in other words, every mitzvah is supposed to create a certain awareness within the human being. Now the question is that the value of the mitzvah? Is that the purpose of the mitzvah? Is the mitzvah to create awareness? Or is there holiness and a connection to God inherent in the mitzvah? In other words, let's say I eat matzah on Passover and I did not meditate. It didn't create any awareness. I didn't think about the reason. I put on tefillin. I light Shabbos candles. I'm not in touch with the deeper spiritual message. So is that a problem? Or is that okay? In other words, or the other way around. What happens if I don't like matzah? Because I don't like, my stomach doesn't like matzah. So I say, you know what, I'm going to skip the matzah. This year I won't have the crackers, but you know what I'm going to have? I'm going to take the message of the matzah. I'm going to think about the humility. I'm going to think about the trust in God. I'm going to think about going into the desert like the Jewish people left without any food. I'm going to think about trusting God even if I don't have any reason to trust God. And I'm going to internalize the message of matzah. So is that good enough? In other words, in any mitzvah we do, are we looking for the sign? The sign would remember, like Jill says, the sign is what reminds us. The awareness that the mitzvah is supposed to produce, or is the mitzvah itself, the act itself, even if it doesn't create any awareness within the mind? And what's the answer? You already know the answer. The answer is both. The answer is that the first mitzvah that God tells Abraham, which is, in other words, the first mitzvah that the Jewish people, in other words, that he tells them for the collective Jewish people, is that every mitzvah has these 2 themes. And they're both in 2 separate verses because they're 2 separate concepts. And the mitzvah, doing the mitzvah creates the covenant. Doing the mitzvah creates the bond. Even if you don't meditate, even if you don't understand why you're doing it, the mitzvah itself is the bond. Now, in addition, there's a beautiful thing. In addition to the actual bond that the mitzvah does, there is also in verse 10, and it was said many times, there's also a nice idea in verse 11. And that is that the mitzvah is also a sign. The mitzvah is also supposed to create awareness of the bond between you and God. But if you don't have the awareness, you still have the bond, right? So that's why Judaism believes that the main thing on Passover is to eat matzah. If you have the awareness, it's the cherry on the top. It's a wonderful thing. It's the kavanah, it's the intention of the mitzvah. But if you just have the intention, you don't do the mitzvah, it's wonderful, but you don't have the actual bond. The actual bond with God, you create through the mitzvah. There's also a beautiful thing to have the awareness of that, and the awareness is verse 11. So I thought that that's a very interesting concept because it gives us insight into all mitzvot. And God tells it to Abraham in this mitzvah, there's awareness, and then there is the actual bond, and there's the awareness of the bond. And they're 2 separate things. Even if you don't have the awareness, you still have the bond. So this is like I said, this is an example. This is God explains this to Abraham at this point in this mitzvah, but it's also really applies to all mitzvot.
Rabbi, Judaism covers all bases. Okay, Judaism covers all bases from the thing written in the body to the things that happens periodically to the decisions that happen to be made on a daily basis. So it covers all aspects of experience.
Yes, we discussed this on Friday. We discussed the Tanya, and we discussed the teaching of the sages. It's a teaching of the sages that's written in the Mishnah, and we say it in our prayer every day. Rabbi Chananah ben Akashia says that the reason why that Hashem gave the Jewish people many mitzvot, 613 commandments. Why? Because Hashem wanted to make the Jewish people meritorious, give them a lot of merit. Therefore, he gave them many mitzvot. What does that mean? It means that, like you say, there's a mitzvah to do everything. There's a mitzvah how to wake up, how to get dressed, how to eat, how to sleep, how to marry. Everything you do, the mitzvot surround your entire life. From morning to night, from when you were a child to you pass on. There's always a mitzvah to be done. And the question is, why are there so many mitzvot? 10 commandments I can handle. 10 commandments I could do. But 613, it just seems a lot. So according to Judaism, what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is an opportunity to bond with God. So when God gives us a lot of mitzvot, it's not a burden. I mean, it could be a burden if we don't appreciate it. But it's not, the purpose is not to create a burden. The purpose is to create opportunities to connect to Hashem. And that's what we're saying. Every mitzvah is a brit, every mitzvah is a covenant, every mitzvah is a bond. And then there's another beautiful thing. If you can be aware and understand the depth of the bond that's being created is wonderful. And that's verse 11, Ot Brit. In addition to the covenant, there's also a sign of the covenant. Sign of the covenant, sign means that you're aware of that. And that's a wonderful thing. You should be aware of that. But if you're not, you still have the covenant. If I'm hugging you and I'm not aware, the bond still exists. So that's just a comment. But go ahead, Steve, and then Vicky.
No, it's interesting. The covenant is certainly multi-generational.
Right.
But the one verse that says, every male among you. Now, is that subject to some interpretation in that, let's say you had a couple working for you and they had a son. Now, that son is among you, but it's not a Jew.
Yes, so Steve wants to know about the obligation to circumcise people who are among you living in your household, even if they're not your children. So you see clearly in this chapter that in Abraham's time that was true. In other words, I don't want to say working for you, but if there was like a servant in the home, the child of a servant, then you were supposed to circumcise him as Abraham circumcises all the members of his household, even not his biological children. You also see in Genesis that we just read last week that according to the Medrash, someone mentioned last week was there someone asked last week, I didn't do my research, I'm sorry, I apologize. Was circumcision widespread in Egypt at the time? There's a Medrash that says that Joseph imposed circumcision on the people of Egypt. When they came to buy grain, he only sold grain to people who were circumcised. That's what the Medrash says. The Medrash says, there's a verse in Parshas Miketz a few weeks ago that the people came to Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, and they say, we need bread. So he says, go to Joseph, do whatever he tells you to do. Well, what's a strange expression? Go to Joseph, buy bread. What does it mean? Go to Joseph, do whatever he wants you to do. So the sages say, so that's an indication that Joseph was trying to do something, that was asking for something that was a little bit unusual. And the people didn't want to do that. So they went to Pharaoh to complain, right? You call the person, you don't like the policies, they can I speak to your boss, right? So they tell Joseph, you want to speak to your supervisor. So Pharaoh says, I'm not getting involved. You'll do whatever you want Joseph to do. So the bottom line is that Joseph influences circumcision according to the Medrash. You also have the story where Shimon and Levi get the whole city of Shechem to circumcise. Now you could say they want to circumcise before they kill them, but just to weaken them as a ploy. But it could be, you see that it's an obligation to circumcise in their mind. Now, after the Torah was given, we don't have that that obligation to influence other people to circumcise. But in biblical times, when there were the laws of the Jubilee, which means you had the laws of servitude, where you can have a servant who's not Jewish, then you actually had to circumcise them if you want them to live in your home. And if they don't want to circumcise, just like if they don't want to accept the basic premises of Judaism, you have to release them. So you're not allowed to let them live in your home. It's called a ger toshav. In the biblical times, there was something called, I'm sorry, not a ger toshav. Ger toshav is a separate story. But the bottom line is there was some indication that under certain circumstances, you would have to circumcise the people living in your home, even if they're not your children or Jewish. And Abraham clearly does it. You also have it later in the Torah, but now all that doesn't apply because we don't really have the laws. Once there's no Jubilee, which would set their slaves free, there's no mitzvot of servitude, so all these mitzvot don't apply. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, you mentioned previously that it's both, right? That the covenant exists and then you circumcise or you eat matzah just to be aware of it. Let's say you don't.
Let me clarify. There is an essential covenant that we're not talking, I'm not referring to that. I mean, the mitzvah creates the bond. Whether or not I'm aware of the mitzvah is a separate story. There's a separate covenant. The fact that we're essentially connected to God, we're not referring to that. For that, you don't need a mitzvah. What I'm saying is the mitzvah creates the bond. Now, if I meditate about the mitzvah and I understand the mitzvah, okay, very good. That's a benefit. That's verse 11. That's a sign of the covenant, which is better than the covenant. But the point here is the sign of the covenant does not replace the covenant. The covenant is the act. And the sign of the covenant is the awareness of the act.
Right, but for example, not everybody will perform the same mitzvah, like all the different mitzvahs are addressed to different people. Let's say a person doesn't eat matzah on Passover, but the covenant still exists, right? There's still, maybe he's not aware of it, but the essential bond exists, right?
Yes. There is an essential bond. There's also a bond by the obligation. The fact that we have an obligation means we have a covenant. Then there's the fact that I fulfill my obligation. That's fulfilling the covenant. And then is being aware of the covenant, right? The Hasidic philosophy explains just the fact that there's a commandment, even if I don't do the commandment, there's already a bond. If I say, please do me a favor, could you help me? Before you help me already, there's already a relationship because I acknowledge that I need you. And there's something that I can't do myself. I need you to do something for this relationship. So the commandment itself is already a bond. Now, when you act upon the commandment, it's a deeper bond.
And you're aware of it's
tangible. And if you're aware, is even better. And if you understand why I want you to do this, so now it's not just a physical bond, but it's also a bond that penetrates my intellect. Right? So there's so many stages and so many things. But in general, what I'm trying to say is you don't conflate them. That's why I have this pet peeve that I can't stand the word, with all due respect, maybe it just triggers me, sorry, is the word ritual, right? People refer to mitzvot as rituals. How come I don't like the word ritual? My mother's cousin made a book about rituals and all different faiths and all different cultures. And it's a book of rituals. I'm sure there's some Jewish rituals there too. I didn't read the book. The bottom line is, why come I don't like the word ritual? Because ritual means that you're doing something to create an awareness. But what you're doing makes no difference, right? The ritual could be we get together and drink coffee. That's our ritual, right? A ritual does not have any inherent value in the thing you're doing. It's just something you do to create a certain awareness, a certain feeling. So I love rituals, don't get me wrong. My kids tell me in the summer, they say, we can't wait for it to snow. Snow. Why do you want to snow? Because when it snows, we get hot cocoa. Okay, that's the ritual in the home. You get snow. When it snows, you get hot cocoa. It's just a nice thing you do. But there's no inherent idea that you have to do this act to create this atmosphere. No, you're just trying to create an awareness. Any act would do it. The Torah, that would fit if all it was is an oat brit. So we get together, we put on tefillin to remind us of whatever. We eat matzah to remind us of the Exodus. Ritual, at least the way I understand the word, maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, then I won't get so triggered by the word. But ritual rings to me that you're doing something to create the awareness. What we're saying is that is an aspect of the Torah and the mitzvah, but that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is not a ritual. The mitzvah is the will of God, which creates the bond. And therefore, it's not interchangeable. You can't say, I don't like this detail, I'll replace it. Oh, it's not convenient to do the Passover Seder on Thursday night, which is the time, we'll do it on Tuesday nights. We'll create, if it's a ritual, what's the difference exactly when and how we do it, right? But if there's inherent value in the bond, because this is the will of God, oh, it's no longer a ritual. It's also a ritual. It's also a sign of the covenant. Okay. Now we want to continue. Now, what I want to do now is I want to take a little bit of a big picture, and I want to read very quick, not very quickly. I want to read the story. I want to read two stories for you, chapter 17 and chapter 18. And I'm going ahead, but I'm going to come back also. The problem with this whole story is that there are two stories of the birth of Isaac. One story told to Abraham, and another story in the next chapter told primarily to Sarah. And everything here is reiterated, and it's a strange why you have to have two stories. And if you read it carefully, you see that there's two promises, and it's not exactly clear why we need both revelations. So what I'm going to try to do now is, okay, you know the big picture. The big picture is that in chapter 17, God comes to Abraham and God says, I'm going to give you circumcision. He promises he's going to give him a son. Not just a son like Ishmael, but your wife, Sarai, we're going to change her name to Sarah, and she's going to give birth to a child to your child. You'll name him Isaac. Okay, so we have a promise that Isaac is going to be born. That's the end of chapter 17. Then we go to the very famous scene, beginning of chapter 18, the next parsha. What's the next parsha? The next parsha is the story with the angels, right? In the stone, it's page 79. Story of the angels. Abraham is sitting at the opening of the tent. 3 angels show up, and Abraham goes and Abraham invites them in, and he gives them food. The whole story, the whole Megillah. And what happens after that story? The angels one of them tells Abraham, where's your wife Sarah? And she says, oh, he's here, she's in the tent. And he says, oh, I'm going to come back in 1 year and your wife Sarah is going to have a child. And she laughs. And God says, why do you laugh? And that distracts us because in this chapter, Abraham also laughs. So how come Abraham doesn't get any criticism for laughing? Sarai laughs and God is upset that she laughed. Everyone's distracted by the details of the laughter. The big question is, why does the angel have to come to Sarah and say, you're going to have a child in 1 year, if just very short while earlier, according to the sages, that's 3 days earlier, God promised Abraham at the covenant of the circumcision, God says, you're going to have a child from Sarah. And God even changes his name. So could you imagine, Abraham comes home to Sarah and says, look, we're changing our name. How come? Because God says, change my name because I'm going to become a father of a multitude of nations. God says, I'm changing your name because you're going to have a child. And then 3 days later, we have the whole spiel again with the angels coming, and the angel has to reiterate that she's going to have a child. Why do you need a second promise if we already had a first promise? That's the big question. The answer is going to be, it may not be the same promise. So I want to read the end of chapter 17, and then go to 18, and then point out, and then try to make some sense out of this. So let's look at verse 15. On page, in the stone, it's page 75. I'm going to share the screen over here. I think I made it a little bit bigger. I hope it's clear. 15, right? Okay, so page 75 in the stone, verse 15, chapter 17. Here we go. And God said to Abraham, your wife Sarai, you shall not call her name Sarai, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will give you a son from her, and I will bless her, and she will become a mother of nations. King of nations will be from her. And Abraham fell on his face and rejoiced. And he said to himself, will a child be born to one who is 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael will live before you. We'll discuss this next week. And God said, indeed, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. And regarding Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. He will beget 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. And he finished speaking with Abraham, and God went up from above Abraham, and Abraham circumcised himself and his whole family, as and Steve pointed out also the people living in his house. So here we have a promise that Sarah is going to give birth to a child, and God says, I'm going to make my covenant with him, with Yitzchak, not with Yishmael. Okay, wonderful story, good to know. It's very inspiring. Now we turn the page. We go to chapter 18. And we have the story with Abraham in the tent, okay? So if you want to look at the stone, it's page 79. Now the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when day was hot. And he lifted his eyes. Okay, we'll skip all of this. He invites the guest. We'll go to verse 9. In the stone, it's page 81. We'll go to verse 9. They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. Okay, so now he says as follows, and he said, one of the angels said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, your wife Sarah will have a son. And Sarah heard from the entrance of the tent, and it was behind her. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, coming on in years. Sarah had ceased to have the way of woman. Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have become worn out, will I have smooth flesh? And also my master is old. Okay, God is upset. That's the story. So we have a wonderful story here. We have a promise to Abraham, promise to Sarah. Why do I need both? That is the question. So there's multiple ways of interpreting this. I'll give you one interesting interpretation that I found interesting, and that is that if you look carefully at the words of the two promises, you will see that there's a subtlety. And I'll spill the beans. I'll tell you what the subtlety is, and then we'll see if we'll track it in the verses. When it comes to verse 17, to chapter 17, when we're discussing in the context of the circumcision, it says, it doesn't say who's having the child. Of course, Sarah is having the child, but you will see again and again, it says, Sarah will have a child for Abraham, for you. She is giving birth to a child for you, but it's Abraham's child. Okay? Let's look at going back to chapter 17. Going back to chapter 17, and we look at, let's start from verse 15 again, same verses. And God said to Abraham, your wife Sarai, in the stone it's 75, page 75, verse 15. And God said to Abraham, your wife Sarai, you shall not call her name Sarai, for Sarai is her name. And I will bless her, and I will give you a son from her. Okay, these are the key words. I will give you a son from her. Abraham laughs. Verse 19. And God said, indeed, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him. Okay, so your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. Okay, again, verse 21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. Okay, what do you have? What is being reiterated again and again, time and again? That Sarah is giving a birth to a child for you. He is considered Abraham's child. Of course, you need the mother, but in chapter 17, the story is told from the perspective of Abraham. Sarah is going to give birth to a child for Abraham. That's the promise in 17. Now we go to 18. In 18, which we read earlier, you go to 18. In 18, with the story with the angel showing up, what does the verse say? So the first thing it says, verse 9, and they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And she said, behold, in the tent. Okay, so one second, what's happening here is Abraham is conversing with the guests. They don't say, where is Sarah, your wife? Please call her. They say, where is Sarah, your wife? And he says he's in the tent. And then they start talking. What they mean is, this is not so much about you. We want to know where Sarah is, because what we're about to say is concerning Sarah. Okay, what do they say? They say, and he said, verse 10, I will surely return to you at this time next year. And behold, your wife Sarah will have a son. It doesn't say your wife Sarah will give birth to a son for you, as it says so many times in chapter 17. Here it says Your wife, Sarah, will have a son. She's having a son for herself. So we have two stories. Why do we have two stories? Because there are two promises. In chapter 17, Isaac is Abraham's son. In chapter 18, Isaac is Sarah's son. Two different promises. Well, in a minute, I'm trying to figure out what the significance of this is. But there are two different promises. Now, if you want to see what gets interesting, is we want to look at the actual story of the birth and figure out which child was born. Was it the child of the promise of 17, or was it the child of the promise in 18? So let's look. We have to skip to chapter 21. Chapter 21 in the stone, it's page 95. This is the reading that we read on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, the birth of Isaac. Let's read. So in the stone, it's page 95, chapter 21, verse 1. On the screen, it's right here. Chapter 95, chapter 21. And the Lord remembered Sarah as he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had spoken. And Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham. Okay, it doesn't say she bore a son. She bore a son to Abraham. What does that remind you of? Chapter 17, the story of the Brit, the circumcision. It's a promise to son to Abraham at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham named his son, who had been born to him, whom Sarah had born to him, Isaac. Okay, that's a wonderful story. This is, again, the verse that Sarah is giving the birth of a child to Abraham. It's Abraham's son. Abraham names him. And verse 4, Abraham circumcised his son when he was 8 days old, as God has commanded him. So we're talking about the circumcision. In the chapter of the circumcision, Isaac is Abraham's son. And that's what happens when they're born. The problem is, not the problem. Then we have verse 6. Verse 5 also, and Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Born to him. It's all about him. Now we'll go to verse 6. And Sarah said, God had made joy for me. Whoever hears will rejoice over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne a son to his old age. So here, verse 7 is a little bit sort of both ways, but verse 6, God had made joy for me. Whoever hears will rejoice over me. So what are we trying to say here? We're trying to say here is that you look at the birth, chapter 17, the emphasis is Abraham. God says, I'm going to give you a child. Sarah will bear a child to you, but it's to you. Abraham, he's considered Abraham's child. Then in chapter 18, we have the story of the three angels coming, and here they change the message. When they come, it's not to change it, it's a different message, a different emphasis, right? We asked, why do you have to have two promises? A different emphasis. The emphasis is when the angels come, they tell Abraham, where is your wife? We want to talk to her. And we say, she is going to have a child. It doesn't say she's going to have a child to Abraham. She is going to have a child. And then when you look at the story of when they actually a child is born in 21, both things come together. Abraham names the child. The Torah refers to it as the child that Sarah bore for Abraham, but it also refers to the child as Sarah's own son. So what we're trying to say here is chapter 17 and chapter 18 are two different themes. They come together at the birth of Isaac. In other words, Isaac is carrying both those promises, but they're two separate promises. That's the easy part. Now, the hard part is, what are the two separate promises? So one way to think about it is that when you look at chapter 17, we are thinking about Abraham as the father of the multitude of nations. Abraham has responsibility for all of humanity. And in that sense, what is Isaac? Isaac is the son of Abraham who has to continue Abraham's legacy. Abraham's legacy is the universal legacy in chapter 17, right? Chapter 17, the Torah says clearly, I'm going to make you a father of a multitude of nations. So Abraham is the father of the multitude of nations. And the promise of Isaac is, I'm going to keep this covenant that I'm making with Abraham. It will be continued with Isaac. So Isaac has to continue his father's legacy. But what is his father's legacy? The universal legacy, the universal responsibility of the Jew to the rest of the world. That is chapter 17. Then we have chapter 18. God comes and tells Abraham and the angels show up. They speak to Abraham. Where's your wife? We have a different story for her. She is going to give birth. And when it comes to who's Sarah, what is Sarah? Sarah is the mother, the matriarch of the Jewish people. And as we will see throughout all the stories that follow, Sarah is much more concerned, the mother is much more concerned with her own family. In other words, in this context, with the Jewish people's story, less with the universal message, because there's always some tension between the universal responsibility and the particular responsibility to raise Isaac as a uniquely Jewish person. So we have the unique Jewish message and we have the universal message, and they play out differently, but Isaac is the bearer of both. And that's why at Isaac's birth, he is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham in chapter 17. He is also the fulfillment of the promise to Sarah at chapter 18. And they both come together within his personality. So that's sort of an overview of the question of why we have two stories and two promises for the birth of the same child. The answer is it's not the same child. I mean, it's the same child, but it's not the same promise. There's two separate promises here, two separate legacies, and Isaac carries both. What are the two legacies? The universal one and the particular one.
Is it possible that the angels wanted Abraham to really realize that though that Isaac was going to be, this very important person, that Sarah had he wanted Abraham to know that Sarah has a very important part in this. And he wanted Sarah to know they wanted Sarah to know she has a very important part in this. And that they had to do this together.
Yes.
And not, let Abraham take over and say, this is more important than that.
Right.
You've got to balance this child.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Go ahead.
I agree that they have to balance the father and mother, but it's interesting. The way that Torah puts it is it calls it in chapter 17, it refers to him as the child of Abraham, chapter 18, the child of Sarah. So
right.
You separate and then combine. Because then if they would just say, if the Torah would just say, yeah, he's the child of Abraham and Sarah, we would never realize the subtlety. We would never realize that there's two separate themes. There's the theme of the bearer of Abraham's legacy, which is the universal message. As we will see, we'll go back to chapter 17. First of all, the name change, that you become a father of many nations. But also you see right away, as soon as Abraham hears about Yitzchak, Abraham says, what about Yishmael? I'm the father of many nations. I care just as much about Yishmael. So we'll deal with that in a moment.
But isn't this the same theme with Esau and Jacob?
Same tension. And
there's always a kid who is like on the low end, and there's always a kid.
I'm not going to say low end. Low end is the not right.
Oh well, okay.
Whatever. Let me clarify. You see the consistent thread. The father is universal. The mother is particular. So with Isaac, father says, I want a relationship with all my children. Yishmael, I want Yishmael. I want Isaac. When it comes to Isaac's the next generation, Isaac says, I see the good in all my children, including in Esau.
Right.
The mother says, okay, you have a universal message. You have to care about everybody, but you also have to cultivate the unique blessing of the person who's going to be the father of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people have the unique mission. And that's how it divides with both generations, both the first generation and the second generation. That's the way it plays out, where the father has the universal message, the mother has the particular. And the child, at least in Isaac's case, with Jacob, it changes a little bit. But in Isaac's case, the same child is burdened. I don't want to say burdened. The same child has to bear, represents both those promises, both those legacies in one child. So that's why you look at the birth. The birth is it's almost like there were two births. The first few verses it says that Isaac was born to Abraham, and then we remember about the mother. The mother says, "I have my own child." Right? You come to imagine you have a circumcision. And the father says, oh, I had a child. And the mother says, I had a child. Who's right? They're both right. But the point is that there's two separate legacies coming together within this one child.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, now let's turn back. Now that we got the big picture, let's turn back to 17. And we talk about the conversation between God and Abraham when God says, oh, I'm giving you a child named Yishmael. So let's look at this. It's actually a little bit strange. Okay, so God gives this great promise to Abraham. And verse 17, Abraham fell on his face and rejoiced. We'll have to deal with that another time, the laughter. Because here they translate rejoice, which is what Rashi says based on the Onkelos, but the Hebrew word is the same word as laughing, which is later Sarah gets in trouble for laughing. Abraham doesn't. We'll deal with that next week, God willing, or the week after. But in any case, so Abraham fell on his face and rejoiced, and he said to himself, will a child be born to one who is 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael will live before you. Meaning to say, I'll be perfectly satisfied if Yishmael will live before you. Meaning to say, Yishmael will be, Rashi says, before you means with the awareness of God, with the awe of God. In other words, if God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to give you a child, and I'm going to make a covenant with that child, Abraham's like, 1 second, what's with my child I already have? Does that mean that he will not be part of my legacy? So Abraham is very concerned about that. Instead of saying thank you very much, he's like, Lu Yishmael, you Yishmael. If only Yishmael, I'll be happy if Yishmael lives before you. I'm not sure I need another son. And God says no. He says, and God says, indeed is the translation. Aval, however, but. In other words, there's no. What Abraham's thinking is not enough. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. And regarding Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him. So even to Abraham, God is saying, no, you're going to have another son, Isaac. The covenant is going to be made with Isaac. Nevertheless, because all your children will be blessed, including Yishmael. And this is consistent with the idea that here we're talking about there's a universal message for all the people, and Yishmael is included in that. So now this brings to this question of why indeed was the covenant with Isaac and not Yishmael? What does Isaac have that Yishmael doesn't have, and how is that expressed in this chapter? So you've looked further down in this chapter, and it says that Abraham, when he got this command, Abraham circumcised himself and his household. So verse 24 at the end of chapter 17 in the stone, it is page 77. Verse 24 reads as follows: and Avram was 99 years old when he was circumcised. When he was circumcised of the flesh of his foreskin, and Yishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised of the flesh of his foreskin. So he was 13 years old, and that's a beautiful thing. Rashi said earlier, we said it last week. Rashi says that this is a great praise for Yishmael, that he was 13 years old and he did not protest. Okay. Now we know, when was Isaac born? Isaac was born, and that's sort of the conclusion of this portion, this chapter and the portion. And all the people of his household, those born to his house and those bought with money from foreigners, were circumcised with him. So that's the conclusion. The conclusion is the circumcision. So we know that Yishmael was circumcised at 13, and Isaac was circumcised, as we will read later, the commandment when he was 8 days old. So the question is, what is better? Is it better to be circumcised at 13 or better to be circumcised at 8 days old? Better, I mean, what is a greater sign of commitment and devotion to God? And there's a medrash. The medrash says that there was a debate between Yishmael and Isaac. Later on, we'll read about their relationship. But amongst that relationship, the medrash says that there was a debate. And Yishmael says, I am superior because I circumcised at 13. And then the medrash says, Isaac says, no, I am superior because I circumcised at 8 days old. Okay, so what does that even mean? We understand the advantage of circumcising at 13 years old. That means that a person could protest. And if they don't, that means that they're devoted to God and they're committed to serve God. Isn't that much greater than circumcising at 8 days old? What value, when Isaac says, I am circumcised at 8, why is that a greater advantage? At 8 days old, why is that a greater advantage? So the Hasidic interpretation is as follows. And that is, what does 13 represent? We know that in Judaism, 13 is when a person becomes mature, they become bar mitzvah. Now they become responsible. Why? Because now they have da'at, now they're mature, now they have knowledge. So if you say you're going to circumcise at 13, it wasn't just a mistake. Yishmael happened to be 13. Well, he happened to be 13 because that's when God commanded Abraham to circumcise, when Yishmael happened to be 13 years old. But it's not by mistake. There's a spiritual energy going on over here. And that is 13 means you're mature, you have wisdom, you have understanding, you have maturity. if you circumcise at 13, it means, what is the foundation of your relationship with God? The foundation of your relationship with God is my understanding. I understand that I want to serve God. I want to commit. I want to be dedicated. I want the covenant. I want the sign of the covenant. But all this is based on my own understanding, my own wisdom, which I achieved when I turned 13. Okay. What is what happens? What is the symbolism of being circumcised at 8 days old? I'm a child. It's not my decision. Oh, so here, my relationship to God is not based on rationale. It's not based on understanding. And because it's not based on understanding, it's not limited to understanding, and therefore it defies reason, and therefore I'm devoted to God, even if I don't understand why I'm doing so. And even if it doesn't understand logical to me, I don't see God, I don't see how this helps me. I'm devoted anyway because my relationship is not founded and therefore limited by understanding. It's a devotion that and a commitment that actually transcends understanding, right? Sometimes you're in a relationship and I ask you, why are you in the relationship? So you can explain to me that it's beneficial to you. It's a win-win. I understand what I'm giving. I understand what I'm getting. It makes sense. It's a wonderful relationship. Yes, but it's also transactional, and the moment you're not getting, you don't understand what you're getting in return, you may not stick around. Then there's a relationship where you're devoted to another person, to a child, to a parent, to a spouse. It doesn't really matter. And I say, why are you here? Why are you devoted? Is there a reason? And you can't really articulate it. You're not getting as much as you're giving, but you're going beyond the reason. And that is the symbolism of being circumcised at 8 days when I do not have the wisdom and maturity of 13. And this is the difference between Yishmael and Isaac from the Hasidic, from the Kabbalistic perspective. One model is I serve God, but it begins at my age of maturity when I understand. The other model is we're trying to cultivate a relationship with God which goes beyond the understanding. Understanding will follow. First Naaseh, then Nishma. First we will do, then we will hear. Now, just going to put in a plug. We'll take questions in a minute. Go back to the beginning of the parsha, because I said the same theme in the beginning of the parsha. The same theme appears in the beginning of the parsha of Lech Lecha, which is the first portion of Abraham, and at the end of the parsha. What was the first thing we asked? We spent a lot of time on this, which was, why is the first commandment, why is Abraham introduced? The Torah only mentions Abraham in the context of when he's 75 years old, fulfilling God's commandment to move to Israel. We asked, why doesn't the Torah tell us about the biography of Abraham before he reached 75? That he discovered God through his own wisdom. And we gave many answers, but the Hasidic answer was, because for us, the Jewish people, the foundation of our relationship with God is not the understanding that Abraham achieved earlier. The foundation of our relationship with God is the submission that Abraham committed to fulfill the will of God. That's the story relevant to us. That's the foundation. After that, you can understand and think about and meditate, like we said. Then you could, once you have the covenant, which is achieved through the devotion, then you can think about what's the message and what's the understanding behind it. But both in the beginning of the parsha and at the end of the parsha, what is emphasized is not the relationship based on understanding, but the relationship based on commitment that transcends understanding. And you know what? That's why we're sitting here today in 2021, because the Jewish people's commitment to God throughout the exile certainly defied rationale. It didn't make sense. That's why so many people said they checked out. But if we're sitting here today, it's because we have the attitude of Isaac, which is that we're committed first and we ask questions later. And that is one way to read this. Thank you much for joining. Any questions, comments, please share. Vicky, please go ahead. Steve, you're next. Bob, and then Steve. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I was wondering if there any significance of Isaac being conceived by Abraham, who was already circumcised. And that ties to my earlier question, like from a week or two ago, why the commandment was not before the Ishmael, but before Isaac.
I have to get back.
Does it mean that the Jewish people bond with Jewish people with God is like a deeper or like unconditional?
Yeah. So Abraham is born. Abraham's circumcision. Abraham is a self-made man. In other words, self-made in relationship with God. He discovers God on his own, and he climbs and he grows. And ultimately, the circumcision is the culmination of everything he did. It's the symbol of everything he did throughout his entire life. For his descendants, for the Jewish people, it works the other way around, because we follow Abraham. So for us, the circumcision is the foundation. and as a foundation, and then we work to actually, okay. I'm going to save it for next week because I have to find a commentary. There's a beautiful kliyakar on this. I'm going to save it for next week, where he explains. He shows it in the verses where in Abraham, first you have the figurative circumcision and then the physical one, and the physical one is the expression of the figurative one that happens within his heart. With his descendants, it's the opposite. That the physical one triggers the figurative one. In other words, the physical triggers the spiritual. But we'll get to that later. But the point here is, yes, as Abraham, when Isaac is born, he is circumcised. He's born to someone who's circumcised. All this happens to a child who, before he has cognition, before he has understanding, and the commitment of circumcision is foundational, not based on logic.
All right. Thank you very much.
Question, Bob, you're next. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, I think we could spend a year, I'm not suggesting.
At least.
Spend a year talking about the particular versus
Yes.
the universal.
Yes.
And I've never taken a comparative religions class, but I think the instructor might discuss the universal versus the particular when comparing religion.
Yes. But
Now, for example, the commandment to love your neighbor, that addresses the particular. And I also want to observe that it's the particular that feels pain. The universal is, just doesn't feel pain.
Right.
The particular.
So that's an excellent point, and that's why I think it's going to tie into what we're going to say next week about the disbelief, where Sarah is considered, she lacks his disbelief, and that probably ties into that when you talk about from the particular message, it has to resonate. The person has more feelings involved and emotions involved. But I agree with you. I'm just going to say one point, and that is that you could think about universal versus particular within comparing religions. That's one way to do it. What I think I'm referring to, not contradicting, but in addition, even within Judaism, there is the divide between Judaism's message to the rest of the world and Judaism's message to the Jewish people. I think, I'm not an expert in comparative religions, but I think most religions say that our message is universal. Everybody has to become Christian. Everybody has to become Muslim. If not, we'll force you to, because we have the truth and there's only one truth. So it's for everybody, right? So Judaism is saying, within Judaism, you have the particular and the universal. We say within Abraham's message is Abraham's message for everybody, is Abraham's message for Isaac. So that becomes interesting because I think we're the only religion that has both those elements. Go ahead.
Well, in terms of the comparative religions, whether Judaism, Islam, Christianity, there's no disagreement over that's not.
Right.
Everybody buys that's not. The question is once you get past the destruction of the Second Temple, the Christians have the New Testament and they have certain sayings about Jesus. Judaism has the Gemara and the Talmud, and they have certain sayings about Jesus. And Islam has the Quran, and they have certain sayings about Jesus. And all three of them are opposed. So the question is, will the real Mashiach stand up, and which book is true? Which book is true? Because there's no certain. But will the real post-destruction temple writings?
Will Mashiach please come? And the answer is he will. And when he comes, everyone will know the truth. And God will be the one, and his name will be one. Go ahead, Bob. That's Zachariah.
Good morning, Rabbi, and thank you. The other covenants that you'd mentioned, Shabbat, Tefillin, are all intentional in terms of on the parts of the people. And you were saying that to do it on the 8th day is unintentional. It's kind of imposed on the child. My question is this a template for us to consider the distinction between mitzvot and hokim?
I think it is, and I think you're right. What I would say is it's also the basic concept of Nasa and Nishma, right? Of course we want to understand, and of course we want to appreciate the mitzvah. But in Judaism, that's secondary, and therefore, like you're right, the covenant of the tefillin, for example, when do you start doing the covenant of the tefillin? When you're 13. Okay, Shabbat, with the obligation of Shabbat, all the mitzvah that we do even before 13 is only chinuch. It's only for education. But the obligation starts at 13 because most of Judaism is internalization, as you say. But however, there's the concept of the chok, which is the decree, which represents the commitment that defies reason. And you're right. So I think that these two elements, the type of covenant that applies when a child is not thinking logically, and then the type of covenant which is supposed to create awareness within the person, is the model for the commandments. Some commandments defy logic, and some commandments are very logical, because in our relationship with God, by the way, as in every relationship, you need an element of both. You need to understand it. You need to appreciate it. You have to understand what it does for you. You have to appreciate it. But again, if I'm in any relationship and I say, you know what, we're in a relationship, I'm only going to do things that make sense to me. Okay, that relationship is not going to last, because part of the relationship is saying it doesn't make sense to me, but I'm doing it for you. Now, that can't be the entire relationship, right? Because otherwise, it's not a relationship. It's just commitment. The relationship is commitment, but also connection, and feeling the connection and appreciating the connection. So you're right. The model within all of Torah, you would see this model where some mitzvot are about commitment, some mitzvot are about internalization and understanding. But the question is, if you press to the wall and say, at the core, what is the difference between Isaac and Yishmael, at least according to this Hasidic interpretation of this Medrash? What's the difference between the Jewish person's relationship with God and the model represented by Yishmael? What's at the core? At the core is what's the foundation? What's the foundation? Is the foundation the idea of I'm willing to commit to God, or is the foundation I have to understand? And both want to do both, right? We also want to understand our relationship with God. We also want to understand why we're doing it, but we do so after the commitment. And that's at least from the Hasidic perspective, that's the interpretation of this Medrash, where Isaac says, "I'm superior because I circumcised at 8 days old." What's the superiority of that? What's better? Why is that better? I mean, what quality does that represent? It's not you. It was done to you. The answer is, that symbolizes my whole approach to life, my whole approach to my relationship with God, which is that I want to understand, but it's not premised and therefore not limited to the understanding.
Thank you, Rabbi.
But thank you, and thank you for the Chukim and Mishpatim edition. Thank you. Okay, wonderful day, everybody. I hope to see you in good health next week. Have a wonderful day.
Yes, Rabbi.
Thank you.